Drive alongside a stretch of railroad track on any ordinary afternoon, and the rail is exactly the color you'd naturally expect it to be. Dull, dark steel, weathered by years of relentless sun and passing trains, blending quietly into the gravel and dust underneath it. Then, somewhere along that same stretch of line, the rail changes completely, seemingly out of nowhere. Bright white, both sides of the rail, painted with the same crisp precision you'd expect to see on a freshly striped highway lane. Nobody paints steel rail out in the middle of nowhere for absolutely no reason at all. Railroads don't exactly spend their money on appearances, of all things. So what is a strip of white paint actually doing out there, sitting on top of tons and tons of solid steel, mile after mile, far from anyone who'd ever even stop to admire it? Let's get into it right here on Simple Things. Not decoration, not random. Whatever this paint is actually doing out there in the sun, it isn't cosmetic in any real, meaningful sense of that word. Railroads track every single dollar they spend with a level of scrutiny most other industries don't even bother applying, and painting thousands of feet of rail simply isn't remotely cheap to do. Something quite specific is being solved here, and it clearly isn't curb appeal along a forgotten stretch of track. The real clue is that the paint is white specifically rather than any other color available, and exactly where railroads have chosen to put it. Not everywhere along the entire line, not randomly chosen either on a whim. Very specific stretches of track under very specific conditions get this particular treatment, and nowhere else along the line ever does. A rail with nowhere left to go. It did not begin with paint at all. It began with a decision, decades earlier, about how rail itself should actually be built. Older railroads used short sections of rail bolted together end to end, with a small, deliberate gap purposefully left at every single joint along the entire route. That gap did real, genuine work. It gave the steel somewhere to expand into on a hot day without anything actually being forced or squeezed anywhere else along the line. The trade-off was a noticeably rougher ride for passengers and crew alike, plus constant, ongoing maintenance, since every single joint was a weak point that eventually wore down, cracked under repeated wheel impacts, or simply needed replacing outright. Modern railroads largely abandoned that older design in favor of something called continuously welded rail, long, unbroken stretches of steel welded seamlessly together for miles and miles at a time without a single joint anywhere along the way. The ride is noticeably smoother from end to end. The ongoing maintenance burden tied to joints mostly disappears entirely across the whole network. But that same welding process removed the one small thing that used to quietly absorb an entire hot day's worth of expansion: the gap itself. A welded rail anchored down to thousands upon thousands of ties, mile after mile after mile without a break, has almost nowhere left to physically grow into once it starts heating up under a summer sun. The old jointed rail could expand a little at every single joint, and nobody riding the train ever even noticed the difference. The new welded rail simply can't expand at all in any meaningful way, not without something eventually giving way somewhere along the line. That constraint, not the raw heat itself, is really where this entire story genuinely starts, whatever the temperature happens to say on any given afternoon. Continuously welded rail solved one very real, long-standing problem for railroads and quietly created a completely different one in its place, largely unnoticed for years, and it took decades before that second, quieter problem became worth solving, with something as simple and unglamorous as an ordinary coat of paint sprayed onto steel. The rail that can't grow, so it kicks. So what actually happens inside a piece of steel that wants to expand but has nowhere left to go? Heat a piece of unattached, loose metal sitting quietly on a workbench, and it simply gets a little longer than before. Nothing remotely dramatic happens. Heat a mile of continuously welded rail bolted down firmly to ties every couple of feet, though, and the steel wants to do the exact same thing it always does, only now it physically can't do it. The extra length it would have gained instead turns straight into pressure, quietly building up inside the rail itself as compressive stress, real energy sitting there with nowhere left to actually release. On an ordinary hot day, the track is engineered from the start to handle that buildup of stress just fine, without any real drama at all. But push the temperature high enough, past what the track was designed to comfortably absorb, and that stress can eventually overcome the rail's own anchoring entirely, and the track doesn't bend evenly or fail quietly the way you might expect. It kicks sideways instead, all at once, sometimes only by a few inches, sometimes considerably more than that. Railroaders call it thermal misalignment. Most people who've heard of it at all know it by a much simpler name, sun kink. A rail that looks perfectly straight and immovable from a car window can, in the right conditions, shift sideways simply because it got too hot to hold its own shape any longer. When that happens near a train, the results range from an unscheduled slowdown to something considerably worse. This is exactly where the white paint comes back into the picture. White reflects far more sunlight than bare dark steel absorbs, and according to Union Pacific, painting the rail can lower its surface temperature by roughly 20 degrees. 20 degrees doesn't sound dramatic on its own, but it's 20 fewer degrees of compressive stress building up inside steel that already has nowhere left to go. Not just metal gets hot. Not a guarantee. It's easy to assume any hot stretch of railroad track carries roughly the same risk of buckling. That's not quite right, and the difference comes right back to how the rail was built. Older jointed rail, the kind with a small gap left in every section, almost never faces this specific problem, precisely because it still has somewhere to expand into. This particular risk, and the coat of paint aimed at reducing it, both belong specifically to continuously welded rail, the design most railroads switch to for a smoother ride and less joint maintenance. Painting an old jointed line white would mostly just be wasted paint. It's also easy to assume white paint on a rail must be directly preventing derailments outright, a clean, simple cause and effect you could print on a poster somewhere. That's actually a somewhat stronger claim than what's really happening out there. A cooler rail is a genuinely safer rail in this particular narrow sense, but temperature was never the only variable at play in the first place. Soil conditions underneath the ballast, how tightly and evenly the rail is anchored down, how recently a stretch was last inspected, all of that still matters just as much as it always did before anyone thought to reach for a paint sprayer. A perfectly painted, perfectly cool rail sitting on badly degraded ballast can still buckle, which is exactly why paint gets treated as one layer of a much larger maintenance program rather than a fix that lets any of those other checks slide. Where the paint actually goes. A high-rail truck fitted with a specialized spray rig crawls slowly along an exposed, open stretch of desert track early on a hot summer morning, warning lights flashing steadily against the pale, cloudless sky, tires crunching over loose gravel and ballast, the crew watching gauges closely and calling out readings to each other over the noise, coating both sides of the rail carefully and evenly in bright white before the worst of the afternoon's building heat has any real chance to arrive later on that same long, exhausting day. A track inspector reviews a stretch of previously painted rail on a routine walkthrough a few years after the original crew came through, noting in a logbook that the white coating has faded to a dull gray in several spots from years of passing wheels and weather, flagging that section for repainting before the surface loses too much of its reflective effect heading into next summer's peak heat. A maintenance planner sits reviewing a detailed heat map of the entire rail network back at a cluttered desk in the office late one quiet afternoon, coffee gone cold and forgotten nearby, marking specific curves and open, sun-exposed stretches of track for painting, while deliberately leaving thousands of shaded or genuinely lower-risk miles completely untouched for now. The limited budget only ever stretching so far in any given fiscal year, as it always somehow does, no matter how carefully anyone actually plans ahead. A little cooler, a lot safer. That white paint was never really there for appearance in the first place, whatever it might look like from a passing car window. It's a simple, almost embarrassingly straightforward way to reflect more sunlight away from the steel, keep the rail underneath it a little cooler, and quietly reduce the thermal stress that can eventually contribute to a rail buckling sideways under exactly the wrong conditions. What looks like a purely cosmetic detail is actually a small, deliberate piece of prevention, quietly protecting a system that moves thousands of tons of freight at a time, day after day, mile after mile. Sometimes keeping all of that moving steel genuinely safe really does come down to something this ordinary and thoroughly unglamorous: a strip of rail, painted white, sitting just a little cooler than it otherwise ever would have been. If this changed the way you look at a railroad track the very next time you happen to drive past one somewhere, let us know in the comments below what you want us to explore next in a future video about railroads. We might make it our next episode. Thanks for watching. History often hides in the smallest details.